Lord of the Oasis. Chapter 341, The Cautious Drondheim. In the early morning, the 10 guys with the great silver coins left. Just like how they were found out, they left in a hurry. They didn't communicate much with Kant at all. They only cared about the realistic benefits and promises for the future. There was indeed not much to talk about between the two sides. They just needed to lie low and slowly infiltrate and develop. Kant had no other requests. If they really wanted to invade the dukedom of Leo or the Silver Platter Kingdom, they definitely would not rely on these people who only yearned for profits. Because since they could choose to be loyal to Kant for the great silver coins, then they could also betray Kant for the great silver coins as well. The many generals and soldiers from the world of Mount and Blade were still trustworthy. At the very least, both sides were in a relationship where one would suffer and the other would prosper. If Kant died in this world, then the system would also collapse, and these characters from the system would also perish. This was the true relationship between life and death. Time. Kant sighed lightly. Walking out of the tent, he looked at the light of dawn seeped through the undulating dunes and stretched his back. The temporary camp was already busy. While the sky was still dark, the civilians got up early to feed the camels with grass and water while preparing breakfast. It seemed that they were planning to set off early and quickly return to the Oasis lookout. There was a reason for this. Their current location was not far from the Oasis lookout. They all had mounts, and based on estimation, they would probably arrive at dusk if they speed up. They did not hesitate. After breakfast, they rested and checked before setting off. The fur coats from last night had all been taken off and stuffed into their bags. They wore cool linen robes and linen hood. They walked smoothly through the pre-planned route. They traveled from early morning until noon. Then, they set up camp to avoid the scorching sun. In the afternoon, they continued to set off. Finally, before dusk, a slender tower appeared on the horizon, like a long needle that was about to pierce the sky. It was the high-level watchtower of Drondheim Castle. Soon, desert cavalry quickly arrived. In the normal inspection procedure, especially before Kant left, Manad was specially ordered to pay attention to the surrounding situation. Therefore, the inspection of Drondheim Castle was even stricter. Even though they had already noticed that it was their camel caravan, they still sent light cavalry to inspect it. All of this was based on caution. Kant was satisfied with this. What he needed was Manad's caution. This son of a noble merchant family from the continent of Karadia was not cautious at the beginning. As a result, he was robbed of all the goods in the carriage by the bandit. In the end, he was reduced to a rundown merchant on the continent of Karadia. In a short period of time, he did not even have the funds to go home. From this event, it could be seen that Manad had learned his lessons the hard way. Now that he was in power and was in charge of the most important castle, Drondheim, Kant had also warned him to be cautious when he was not around. Manad would definitely do as he was told. If something really went wrong, no one would be able to shoulder this responsibility. There's a huge change. Kant rode his horse closer to his castle. There were already many construction workers busy at the south gate. At the same time, they piled up large pieces of stones, making it look like a new city wall was being built. Bunduk nodded from behind. It is indeed huge. Welcome back, Lord Kant and Bunduk. Manad was walking out quickly. When he bowed respectfully, his gaze was slightly shocked, especially when he looked at Bunduk, who was riding on a black horse. After some hesitation, he laughed dryly and said, "Hey, you change a lot. I almost thought it was someone else." Bunduk nodded calmly. Time can change everything. His had a drastic change and became an underworld apostle. This was different from the previous captain of the crossbowmen or being conferred as a noble and automatically becoming a civil protection officer after being conferred the estate. It was a complete transformation. From the appearance of Bunduk to his personality, and even the power he possessed. It was a complete transformation. Back when they were partners of the justice side, their relationship was very close. They met each other in a tavern on the continent of Karadia. They could even have a few drinks to chat about life. They were friends that could not be more familiar. However, things had changed when they met again. A sense of strangeness appeared out of nowhere. If it was not for the fact that Bunduk's appearance had not changed much, Manad would almost think that he was someone else. After all, after becoming an apostle of the underworld, Banduk's originally righteous and humorous temperament, as well as his perseverance, suddenly changed into a gloomy, oppressive, dark, and hidden temperament that was related to the underworld. If he used the power of the underworld, it would add even more sinister and terrifying, extremely evil and terrifying aura. Bunduk had gone through a fortuitous encounter. Kant explained, "It's like being reborn, but he is still loyal to me." Pausing for a moment, Kant looked at the frowning Manad and shook his head, "No matter what, I need all of you to stay united." Manad looked at Bunduk, who was now like a stranger, and gently sighed, "Of course." He had already guessed why Bunduk had changed. The recovery from his injuries back then was actually not a secret. "Lord, let's go in." Manad quickly composed himself and welcomed Kant's return. At the same time, he reported to Kant, "Currently, the 2 barbicans outside the castle are almost finished. I estimate that in 3 days, the main body will be completed. When that time comes, it will be ready to build the arrow tower and watchtower on it." "Very good." Kant nodded. He also saw the towering barbicans. The pedestrians and construction workers passing by all bowed and greeted Kant. Many people were looking at him eagerly. After all, this was the respect to a supreme lord who was like a father and god. Kant was calm. It was not the first time he received such an enthusiastic gaze and courtesy. He rode his horse back to the council hall. Bunduk, the Lion Knights, and the mages walked in together. The golden discs, which had been transported all the way here, was also moved in at this time. As the linen cloth cover was pulled away, the golden light immediately lit up the entire council hall. It was as if there was a new sun. "This special power, it's really powerful. That's right, I feel that my physical strength is recovering rapidly. My extraordinary power is also growing." The royal knights who were originally stationed in the council hall exclaimed one after another. Their extraordinary power, which originally belonged to the positive energy of the king's power, was now bathed in this golden light. It was as if their whole body being was bathed in the warm sunlight, feeling extremely comfortable. And the stamina and extraordinary power that they had used up after standing guard for a day were beginning to recover. They all had a good rest. Kant, on the other hand, had a surprised look on his face. He raised his eyebrows slightly and turned his head to ask the mages, "It seems that this sun disk of ours has a special effect on the royal knights. Perhaps it's the replenishment of the same energy." The mages came to a conclusion. In fact, they were also very surprised. This was something they had not expected. Although they had developed this strange object, in fact, they still had not figured out how to use it. They were still at the stage of fumbling and researching. Although they could control it now, it was all thanks to the modifications made by the magic system of the Unfoth Empire. Only then could they control this solar disk. Otherwise, they would really be at a loss. At this moment, new mage apprentices came down from the top floor. They were the 6 of them who had been recruited in the past 3 weeks. When they saw Kant, they immediately bowed and greeted him, "My lord." "Yes." Kant nodded to them. After the 6 mage apprentices bowed, they looked at the sun disk with shining eyes. The rich positive energy was gathering, which made them extremely shocked, especially when the magic system of the Unfoth Empire was contained in it. It made these apprentices even more excited when they saw it. However, seeing the 18 mages who were still whispering to each other and discussing matters, these apprentices still walked over respectfully, as if they were students saluting their teachers. "Greetings, mages, new apprentices salute you." "Oh, new mage apprentices." The mages were still very enthusiastic. Welcome, we can study together. After all, they were all apprentices, and there was not much level suppression on them. Kant sat on his main seat and clapped his hands. He signaled for them to focus their attention. All right, let's stop reminiscing and discussing. I need you to fuse the sun disk completely now. It's best if our sun disk becomes a perfect posture that can cover the entire castle. Of course, we'll start now. The mages did not hesitate. The sun disk floated half a meter above the ground. On its 3-meter diameter, golden patterns flashed with light. It looked mysterious and magnificent. Wait. Kant suggested, go to the top floor of the council hall. He frowned slightly. If this sun disk becomes bigger, I don't think there's a way to transport it out of the hall. I don't want to tear down the wall that has already been built or make a big crack on the top of the council hall. Sorry, our negligence, the mages apologized. This was indeed something they did not expect. After all, the current sun disk was 3 meters in diameter. It could be transported in thanks to the lack of thickness, as well as the fact that the gate of the council hall could all be opened, tilting the sun disk to let it in. If it was fused with other sun disk and became more than 5 meters in diameter, then there was no way to transport it out. You guys handle this matter properly. Kant waved his hand, feeling helpless against these ivory tower-like scholar. Being a mage was carefree. Even if they were on the battlefield, throwing spells was enough for them to battle. As for the other problems, there was no need for them to worry about. They were like the noble on the battlefield was graceful and luxurious. The mages set out to do it. The mage apprentices and lion knights also helped at the side. The hall immediately became quiet again. Kant then nodded and sighed a little helplessly. He asked Manit in front of him, during the time I was away, did anything strange happen in the depths of Narration Desert? Manit said solemnly, no, Lord. Everything is normal. That's good. Kant heaved a sigh of relief. However, Manit still frowned slightly, his expression remained solemn. However, we discovered that although there were no unusual movements in the Narration Desert, the surrounding natural environment had undergone a great change. In particular, the night had become colder, especially in the salt mines. A large number of slaves had already frozen to death, numbering close to 300 people. Chapter 342, Losing the Salt Mine Posthouse. The death of slaves happened from time to time. After all, as slaves captured from the battlefield, they were not treated as friends by the victors. Cruel torture was everyday routine for these slaves, and they had to suffer in the harsh living environment. They did not have enough food, clothing, or rest, and could not be effectively replenished. Even if they were sick, they still had to go to work. Want to rest? Hee, there would be a friend who used to be familiar with him, who was now the supervisor and the loyal lackey of the victor. He would use the tough whip to wake you up and bring all the sick slaves with him to finish the work that needed to be done today. If one became a slave, he would basically not be treated as a human. He would basically be a human-shaped animal. This was the truth. Every day, a few slaves would die in the salt mines. Kant already knew this. However, looking at the increasing amount of coarse salt in the warehouse, the deaths of these slaves became very valuable, at least for Kant. He had stored a large amount of coarse salt. In the future, after the salt mines were lost, it could be produced for several months. At least at the moment, the salt-making workshop in Drondheim Castle could no longer keep up with the speed of the storage. Although a large amount of table salt had been produced day and night, most of the warehouses were still full of linen sacks full of coarse salt, which were brought by the caravans that traveled to and from the castle and the salt mines every week. Even if more than half of the slaves had died, there were still nearly 700 people left. Kant naturally did not care. Keeping so many slaves and providing a large amount of food and water was troublesome. Wait. In a flash, Kant frowned. He turned to Manit, and asked, are you saying that a special natural phenomenon appeared in the depths of the Narration Desert, which led to the death of a large number of slaves. Yes, the temperature at night is even lower. Manad nodded. This Kant frowned. Something is indeed wrong. This was very unusual. Although the temperature at night in the Narration desert was indeed very low, it was not so ridiculous. One had to know that Kant valued his slaves. At the very least, each of them had a leather jacket, and there was a bonfire burning around the tent at night for everyone to keep warm. How could he freeze nearly 300 slaves to death so easily? If they put more labor loads to these 300 slaves, they would have been exhausted to death. Perhaps it's the undead. The lion knights beside him spoke. They also had their own views on the unconventional weather. No, it's just the undead. These undead were resurrected from the dead, they were between life and death, and will emit negative energy of the undead. After all, the Pendar continent had a magic inheritance. Kant nodded. Yes, continue. The notable feature of the negative energy of the undead is the cold. The Lion Knight continued, ice will cover the earth, and everything can be frozen. That is the condensation of the will of the dead, and their hatred for the creatures living in the sunlight world is a kind of negative energy. Where the sky veil of death spread to an area, their ice spreading at that are as well. The royal knights also nodded and said, there is also a bone-piercing cold current that even the sand layer will be frozen solid. Yes. Kant said in a deep voice, trouble is coming. Trouble. Manad also muttered in a low voice. This was not the first time he had heard this sentence. He also knew how dangerous the undead that were slowly coming from the Narration desert were. However, he did not expect that the danger that he had worried for a long time would arrive so quickly. It had even approached to the salt mine, and it was getting closer to the Oasis lookout. When they first entered the depths of the Narration desert and encountered the sky veil of death, they had already experienced that terrifying cold current. If it was not for the protection of the extraordinary power, they would probably have frozen to death in the depths of the desert, along with their horses. That cold current was not something that ordinary people could withstand. Damn it! Kant frowned and cursed. But without hesitation, he turned his head and ordered, inform the mages, speed up their progress immediately. Yes, the knights who acted as guards immediately responded and quickly walked up to the top floor. There were mage apprentices' dormitories there, where the mages conducted magic experiments and planned to fuse the sun discs. As long as the sun disk took shape and protected the Oasis lookout, Kant's castle would be safe. At the very least, there was no need to care about the threat of the sky veil of death. They were in the middle of a discussion. The door of the council hall was pushed open, and a desert bandit quickly rushed in. Half kneeling in front of the long table, he quickly reported, "My lord, the salt mine has discovered the sky veil of death and was attacked by the undead forces. It has been lost." What? Kant instantly stood up from his seat. He clenched his hands and looked at the desert bandit who half kneeled in front of the long table. His breathing quickened. How is it possible that the salt mine was lost just like that? It's true, it was 2 days ago. The voice of the desert bandit sounded like he was crying. We have all retreated. He still looked travel-worn. One could even see the marks of knives and axes from his leather armor. Even his blood had turned slightly black, and the wounds were cyan purple. Although the wounds had healed, it was obvious that they had been infected by something wicked. Even the lips of the desert bandit had turned white, and his face was sickly yellow color. Just as the desert bandit finished reporting, a strange red color suddenly gushed out of his cheeks, and he collapsed in front of Kant. He fainted. A lion knight went over and stretched out his hand to check his breath. After checking, he said in a deep voice, "He needs treatment and rest." The royal knights also sighed softly. It seems that he rushed back from the salt mine. Men, take him down for treatment. Kant waved his hand. At the same time, he ordered Bunduk, who was frowning slightly, go and take a look. Who else knows the details? I need to know the details and know how my salt mine fell. Yes. Boonduk nodded and left quickly. Someone beside him also carried away the unconscious desert bandit. After that, he would receive the necessary treatment and rest. At the very least, there were doctors trained in the artisan union, although the effects were definitely not as good as top doctors like James. However, it was still not a problem to deal with minor infections and wounds. After all, there would be people who were injured in daily life. On the training ground, the high-level troop class would train the low-level troop class. From time to time, they would cause injuries due to mistakes, so they trained a group of doctors. They could treat their own people if there was emergency. During the war, they could even be treated as a battlefield doctor to take care of the injured. Manad sighed softly beside him. The situation is critical. That's right. Kant gritted his teeth and sat back on his chair. The Lion Knights and Royal Knights beside him remained silent. Each and every one of them had a look of determination on their faces. The war was about to begin. Everyone already understood that the salt mine had fallen so quickly. This meant that it was time for the most elite troops of Drondheim Castle to go on stage and take back the salt mine. Soon, Boonduk returned with a solemn expression. Bad news, he spoke slowly. Speak. Kant frowned. He was mentally prepared. Boonduk reported in a deep voice, the salt mine fell very quickly. All the slaves were frozen to death. Only the desert bandits from the salt mine Posthouse came out. They quickly came to the castle to report. Right behind them, the 500 elite Swadian knight and 2 royal knights were entangled by the terrifying undead troops. This is really surprising. Kant's eyes flashed with malevolence. It had only been a few days, and the camel caravan had just reported that 300 people had been frozen to death. In the blink of an eye, desert bandits had returned, saying that the salt mine had fallen. How could this not be surprising? In Kant's eyes, his plan in the salt mine was absolutely foolproof. Although it was mainly to prevent the slave rebellion, there were still people who had taken the lead to investigate Skyvale of Death in the depths of the Narration Desert. That was a heavy cavalry unit led by 2 royal knights. There was a total of 500 Swadian heavy cavalries. They could be called elites. But even so, they were still entangled by the undead. They actually needed the desert bandits to come back for help. Also, Lord Kant, Boonduk continued, according to the accounts of the other desert bandits, the Skyvale of Death did not spread over. It was just that the undead suddenly appeared like they were launching a sneak attack. They were caught off guard. Wait. Kant narrowed his eyes. A sneak attack by the undead. Yes. Boonduk nodded. Kant's expression turned cold. He could not help but grit his teeth and say, I think I heard it right. It was actually a sneak attack by the undead? These dead skeletons would even use such a tactic. Kant could not help but be puzzled. The undead did not have intelligence. They only had an instinctive hatred for the living and formed a sea of undead to attack the enemy. The concept of sneak attacks didn't exist among the undead at all. Or it could be said that these undead didn't even have a formation. It was due to the instincts of the undead creatures. The soul flames attracted each other and gathered together in a mess. Only when they devoured and wiped out all the enemies would they willingly go into hibernation. It's the Death Knights. Boonduk slowly said, there are also skeleton cavalry. Hey! Kant raised his eyebrows. They are similar to the knights who were lured by the power of the underworld, but they are the cavalries that were transformed by the power of the undead after they died, Boonduk explained. It seems that they are the mobile forces of the undead. Kant's face turned gloomy. He had already understood the concept of the Death Knights or the skeleton cavalry. He had already known this in his previous life, so he could easily imagine it. However, Kant's expression became even more angry. He said in a gloomy tone, I originally thought that these undead were just skeletons and zombies. I really didn't expect that even the Death Knights and skeleton cavalry would appear. Could it be that in the end, there would be things like bone dragons? In Kant's impression from his previous life, the undead did indeed have such things. And in this world, there were actually creatures like giant dragons. Although it had long become a legend in the age of the gods, just thinking about it made one terrified. Chapter 343, finally, a good news. Skeleton dragons, the strongest troop class of the undead race. Furthermore, the world Kant lived in had the existence of giant dragons according to the legends. Although the entire race had already perished in the endless river of history, there were only legends left. But since there were legends, it meant that there had been such a powerful creature before. It could still appear in this world now. The undead race did not care if the giant dragon died. As long as they found the skeleton of the giant dragon and took it under control, it would be no problem for the undead to revive the skeleton dragon filled with negative energy and controlled it. Kept in mind that this was a fantasy world. It had once had a powerful fantasy history. Even the gods and demons had existed before. Even though it had fallen at the lowest point of its power in history and was in the end of the magic era, who knew if it could still be revived, allowing the gods that had once been high and mighty, the demons that had occupied the abyss, to reappear in this world. At that time, humans would no longer be the world's overlord. The most crucial thing. Even now, the human kingdoms were not the overlord races of this world. Far to the south were the dwarf kingdoms in the hilly region, the beastmen tribes in the wilderness to the southwest, the elf republic on the Mannheim coast, and even the city-state kingdom of Greymane of the Jack Allen and the Lizard Kingdom. These were all races that competed with the human kingdoms for world supremacy. Humans were not the only ones. Now, there were also gods and demons lurking in the dark, resting and recuperating for 10,000 years. There was also the undead race that had undergone a special change. The situation was extremely complicated. Although it still seemed to be quiet and everything was peaceful, once it erupted, the entire continent would probably fall into a world-shaking change. Even Kant, who had been in contact with these hidden forces for the longest time, would probably have to be cautious. The real storm was about to arrive. The undead that they were encountering now were just small skirmishes. A storm is coming. Kant gently rubbed his temples, his gaze cold. Looking at the silent knights in front of him, he looked at Bunduke and ordered, "Immediately gather the troops and head to the salt mine Posthouse. At the same time, rescue the heavy cavalries that are entangled." Yes, as the military commander, Bunduke was the first to respond. Also, Manad. Kant turned his head to look at this elite merchant. "Here." Manad immediately stood up and bowed respectfully to Kant. He lowered his head and said, "Lord Kant, please instruct me. You will still be in charge of the castle's defense." Kant did not assign him any other tasks. This merchant was better at managing the trade caravan or engaging in commercial activities. It was difficult to get his hands on matters related to war. However, he was only in charge of the castle's defense and was on high alert to prevent the castle from falling. His carefulness towards merchants was still very useful. This was also why Kant could entrust him with the heavy responsibility of guarding the castle. Although his commanding of the heavy cavalries was not as good as Firentis, he was also inferior to Rolf in commanding the light cavalries and light footmen, and Bunduke in commanding the crossbowmen and other long-range troops. It was still not a problem for him to defend a certain place with simple military defense. Of course, the key point was that Kant had too few talents available. Logically speaking, Bunduke was more suitable to defend the castle. After all, he was once the captain of the crossbowmen and was extremely experienced in commanding the crossbowmen to defend the city. However, at the moment, Kant needed Bunduke to follow him to the salt mine to assist in commanding the troops, as well as to use his powerful strength of an underworld apostles to help. He could not be left here. By using the skill invasion from the underworld, Bunduke could summon a small team of underworld invaders every day. Or he could use demonic incarnation to release all the devil's power and transform into a devil of the underworld to fight. These skills were all extremely terrifying, extraordinary powers. Bunduke could be very useful in the battle. "Go and make the arrangements." Kant waved his hand. His expression was grave and there was a hint of fatigue. No matter what, you have to be careful. This is a period of time that you have to hold on for. There can't be any mistakes. Yes, everyone in the hall responded in unison. Right. Just when everyone turned around and was about to leave, Kant spoke again. Looking at them, Kant frowned and specifically instructed Manad, from now on, put the training ground into full use. I need to train an additional 500 footmen and 300 crossbowmen to help defend the city. Understood. Manad nodded. Everyone went forward to make proper arrangements. This was a must. The pressure on the city defense in the future would definitely be huge. 500 footmen and 300 crossbowmen would be the basic force to defend the city. In addition, they would be able to recruit Viegir's archers. As long as they could supplement their long-range firepower, it would be considered basic safety. However, Kant would not underestimate the undead. Even the Death Knights and skeleton cavalry had appeared. Perhaps there would be even more terrifying undead forces. No matter what, Drondheim Castle must not be lost. This was Kant's territory. It was the main place where Kant could control the Narration Desert. If they lost the Oasis lookout and this castle, it would mean that Kant's forces would collapse in the entire Narration Desert. They could only put the military pressure on the not yet fully built Narration city, which was still in its embryonic form. It would cause unpredictable consequences. At the very least, Kant's strategic plan would be completely ruined, and Narration city in the Sceneway range would be attacked by the undead. They could only hold on bitterly, and even expose themselves to the eyes of the dukedom of Leo and the other human countries. This was not good news. However, just as Kant was deep in thought, good news came. At the stairs, a mage apprentice walked down quickly and shouted anxiously, "My lord! My lord! Be quiet!" Kant frowned. He could not hold back the anger in his heart because of trivial matters. He directly reprimanded him, "Learn to be steady. I don't want anyone in the hall to be so loud and anxious." "My lord, I'm sorry," the mage apprentice quickly apologized. "I'm just excited." Of course, he could see that Kant was not in a good mood, so he did not dare to get into any trouble at this time. He stood on the spot obediently and reported, "We have merged with the sun disks, and there has been a wonderful change. We hope you can observe it personally and witness the next miraculous moment." "What's going on?" Kant was slightly stunned, and his furrowed brows relaxed slightly. "The miraculous moment?" "Yes, my lord." The mage apprentice reported obediently, "After our research, the sun disk has already reached its limit after fusing. Perhaps after another fusion, it can obtain even greater power. Thus, Leader has asked me to invite you to witness this miraculous moment together." "Yes, I understand." Kant nodded. He stood up and his expression returned to normal. "Perhaps this is the only good news that I feel is possible." Chapter 344, The Evolution of the Sun Disk. This was indeed good news. But Kant had already expected this. After all, he had already guessed that when the sun disk fused with multiple strange objects of the same type, it would undergo a qualitative change, perhaps bringing more effects. Now, the effects had appeared. Kant was indeed curious. "Let's go." He took the lead and took a step forward. Yes, the mage apprentice still obediently followed behind, his eyes filled with unconcealable joy. Lord Kant was clearly in a bad mood. If their research results could make Lord Kant happy, then they were contributed for loosen up the intense atmosphere before a war. It was a matter that was worth rejoicing over and full of honor. They didn't say much. The two of them walked up the spiral stairs to the top floor of the council hall. 50 Viegir marksmen were standing guard with longbows in their hands. Their eagle-like eyes scanned their surroundings. If there was the slightest movement, these top archers would use their superb archery skills to deal with it. Of course, everything was safe now. "My lord," at the entrance of the apprentices' dormitory, two mages were standing there. Seeing Kant coming over, they hurriedly took 2 steps forward, bowed respectfully, and said gently, "It's a great honor for you to participate in our research. This is the greatest encouragement for us." "Yes, I'm looking forward to your miraculous moment." Kant nodded. Since these mages spoke so grandly, he was indeed curious. They entered the dormitory. Unlike the small and narrow appearance from the outside, the inside of the dormitory was actually very spacious. This was a space-folding spell from the Unfoth Empire. Kant was already used to this, but what attracted his attention the most was the living room, which was emitting a sparkling golden light. It was like a huge ball of light that was emitting a bright sun disk. "My lord," in the living room, the other mages and mage apprentices were holding their staffs and waiting. The space was filled with faint elemental fluctuations. On the sun disk, within the mysterious sacred sun pattern, threads of golden light were flowing. It was crystal clear, just like the rapidly rotating golden liquid. Under the control of the surrounding mages and apprentices mages, mysterious patterns were formed. It was the power of the sacred sun pattern from the era of the ancient gods. Yes. Kant looked at the 6-meter-long sun disk in front of him, and his eyes were filled with surprise. Not bad. This sun disk has already fused with 4 strange objects of the same type, and the positive energy it contains has reached its peak. According to our perception and calculation, when the 5th disk is fused with it, it will undergo a complete transformation. The mage leader walked over and bowed respectfully. At the same time, he pointed at the sun disk that was still floating in midair and reported in a gentle voice, "This transformation can definitely be considered outstanding. It can allow this sun disk to completely develop the power it once possessed." Kant nodded and then asked, "Are you confident?" "Very confident." The mage leader answered firmly, "We have made ample preparations." "Very good." Kant's lips curled up slightly. This news is indeed delightful. Looking at the mages in front of him, his expression became solemn. He said seriously, "But now, we are about to face a dangerous situation." The mages' expressions also became solemn. They still did not know about the news from the salt mines Posthouse. However, they already had some rough ideas. In fact, when Lord Kant said this, they all thought of the northern part of the Narration desert. It was said that the depths of the desert had been occupied by the undead. In the world of Wind of Wars, the enemies of the Unfoth Empire were also included, the undead. That's right. Kant looked at everyone looking at each other and seemed to be in deep thought. He nodded and confirmed, "The undead have indeed come." His tone paused for a moment. He continued in a solemn voice, "Just now, a light cavalry came to report that the army of the undead had already passed through that seemingly endless salt and alkali soil. They arrived at the salt mine Posthouse to launch a sneak attack. They also killed all of the thousands of captives that we had stationed there. Even the army's fate is unknown." "What? Those undead are expanding so quickly?" The mages widened their eyes in shock. They had thought that the undead they encountered were just a small number of troops and that it was just a warning. But now, the severity of the situation had exceeded their understanding. Although they were focused on magic research, as war mages, they had a certain understanding of the battle situation. And at the salt mine Posthouse, at least 2 royal knights, 500 Swadian heavy cavalries, and 50 desert bandits were defeated so easily. This was enough to prove the strength of the undead army. Even if the undead launched a sneak attack, the troop shouldn't be ended up in such a miserable state. Kant's words were simple. But the truth was really cruel. All the captives had died, so it was nothing to them. However, 500 Swadian heavy cavalries were entangled, and the lives of 2 royal knights were unknown. That would be a big deal, and it was enough to attract the attention of anyone. This was a heavy cavalry unit led by a grand knight with extraordinary powers. Not to mention the undead, whose individual combat strength was weaker. Even if the elite troops of the Dukedom of Leo came from all directions, they would still be able to kill their way out. Even if it were an army of demons with stronger individual combat strength and a crazed thirst for blood, it was estimated that even 300 large demons would not be able to handle this 500 men heavy cavalry unit. They were a mobile unit led by 2 Grand Knights after all. When Kant stationed them there, guarding the captives was one of their missions. There were other factors as well. Guarding against the undead that appeared in the Narration desert was also their mission. That's right. Kant took a deep breath. When he heard the news, he was similarly shocked. Looking at the mages in front of him, he said in a deep voice, "That's why we are now in a very dangerous situation. If you can confirm that you have fused with the sun disk, then be more serious and make sure that the effects of the sun disk are maximized." "We'll do our best," the mages answered in unison. Kant nodded and waved his hand. "Then let's begin." The fusion began. The preparatory work had long been completed. The mages chanted a mysterious spell and used their own magic power as a medium to communicate with the Unfoth Empire in the world of Wind of Wars. They let the powerful magic power from the Grand Mage Tower permeated and transformed the sun disk. Their heart was filled with excitement. They also forcibly controlled the divine power belonging to the sun god in the sun disk. Golden light swirled. The 5th disk placed next to it turned into a golden stream of light. The sun disk, which was suspended in the room half a meter high and had been transformed by the magic of the Unfoth Empire, was like a refugee who had been thirsty for days. It devoured and absorbed the golden stream of light from the other disk. There was a tiny data chain contained within it, fusing into the sun disk in the golden light. It did not take too long. After a short 3 minutes, the fusion was complete. On Kant's retina, a dialog box appeared. Ding system prompt. Sun disk, repairing, absorbs the power of the same source, obtaining new special effect, sun domain. Special effect 4, sun domain. The area of coverage will be expanded by an additional 500,000 square meters, 5 hectares. Divine radiance will be spread throughout the area, allowing the creatures bathed in it to be healthy and the plants to thrive. The dialog box was faded. Kant's eyes instantly turned into surprise amidst the shock. His breathing was rapid. He forced himself to calm down, but he couldn't hide his smile as he was at cloud 9. He looked at the mages in front of him who were putting down their staffs and looking at him. He praised, "Well done. This is what we should do." The mages immediately smiled. "You all deserve praise." Kant said the truth. If it were not for the urgency of the situation, he would have been willing to hold a celebration for these mages. The coverage of the sun disk directly increased to a terrifying area of 5 hectares. Not to mention the Drondheim castle, it could be said that even half of the Oasis lookout was covered by this improved sun domain. It was a significant buff. Moreover, there was still 25,000 square meters, which was 2.5 hectares of the original coverage area. It added up to 7.5 hectares. More than half of the Oasis lookout was already under the protection of the sun disk. And right beside Kant, there were still 5 sun disks waiting to fuse. When the time came, it would no longer be 7.5 hectares of coverage area, but at least 10 hectares of coverage area. The entire Oasis lookout was already under the protection of the sun disks. How could Kant not be happy? But he still forcefully suppressed his excitement. Breathing steadily, Kant looked at the mages and said calmly, "Continue to fuse with the sun disks according to the current status. I look forward to the new changes that will occur after these disks are fused." "Yes," the mages replied in a deep voice. As the incantation was chanted, the new fusion began. The 5 sun disks placed next to them also turned into golden light one by one. They were absorbed and fused like tiny streams of light. As they disappeared one by one, the golden light became brighter and brighter. And the sun disks that was suspended in mid-air finally became bigger and bigger. At the same time, the system dialog box popped up. Ding system prompt. Sun disk, repairing, absorbing the same source of energy, new special effect, purifying pulse. Special effect 5 purifying pulse. After miraculous repair, the sun disk can release a pulse containing extremely positive energy once a week, purifying any target and erasing it in the world. Remark: extremely powerful, please use with caution. On his retina, a new dialog box appeared. Kant's eyes widened slightly. He couldn't control his excitement now. Another new special effect appeared. It was powerful and terrifying. For this, the system even said a remark to explain it. And the sun disk in front of him had completely expanded to a diameter of 20 meters, with a thickness of 10 centimeters. The whole thing looked like a shrinking sun. Golden light was emitted from it, one could feel the brilliance and brightness in it, but it was not dazzling. There were still dense sacred sun pattern carvings on it. They turned into a circle in the center and were even more profound, just like it was gathering positive energy that could destroy everything. Chapter 345, When the Sun Rose Again. The golden disk emitted a gentle light. The fine, sacred sun pattern formed an even more mysterious array. The huge disk with a diameter of 20 meters was meticulously carved, infused with a sacred sense that made people worship in awe. The pure golden light flowed rapidly in the sacred pattern. A soft gold light was emitted. The sun disk stood tall in the hall, as if it was in another dimension, releasing its own mighty power. That was the power of the sun. It was also the light of the sun. And the current 20-meter-long sun disk was like a new sun. Kant and the others standing in front of the sun disk could only look up at the huge object. They could not maintain their calm. It was worth taking a deep breath over, but in fact, their inner emotions had already been turning their world upside down. It's truly spectacular. Kant could not help but sigh. That's right, it was truly incomparably spectacular. The visual impact it gave him is indeed perfect. If it was not for the fact that the apprentice dormitory contained the magical technology from the Unfoth Empire, just this 20-meter-tall, 7-story apartment building-sized golden disc alone would be enough to burst the entire building. It would not be swallowed into the dormitory like this. It's really powerful. The mages were also shocked. In fact, even they did not expect that their dormitory would have such a powerful space-folding technology to accommodate this huge sun disk. The only one who could barely calm down was probably the mage captain who was in charge of everything. However, he was still panting heavily. He forced himself to calm down. The captain explained to Kant, "My lord, this is a spell that originated from the Grand Magic Tower of the Unfoth Empire. 30 top-notch great mages cast their magic power together and used the dormitory as a node medium to make the space here collapsible in a short period of time. It can also fit such a huge object." "Is that so?" "It's a very powerful spell, a very astonishing ability." Kant nodded slightly. Great mages were the strongest among mages. Of course, he understood. Since it was 30 top-notch great mages working together to break through the void and assist, then it was not too surprising. This was also the reason why Kant felt a little more relaxed when he heard that there were so many great mages. In terms of magic knowledge, great mages could be said to have reached the pinnacle of human existence, and they were moving towards stronger creatures. And creatures at this level. They were already powerful existences like angels, titans, dragons, vampire kings, and abyss demons. The expressions of the surrounding mages and mage apprentices were also much more relaxed. After all, they were war mages from the Unfoth Empire. They knew that these great mages, who often existed in the magic towers as the highest tower master and leader, in fact, represented the peak of war mages and were the strongest existences. They had mastered the strongest magic in the world, and they had explored and researched deeper into the magic level. They could be called invincible. "Thank you for your praise." The mage captain's face was still solemn. He said in a heavy voice, "But, my lord, according to my perception, those great mages can't last long. We have to make a decision." Kant frowned when he heard the captain's solemn tone. "What decision?" "Let the sun disk." The captain hesitated slightly. But looking at Kant's probing gaze, he still said firmly, ascend to the sky. Kant frowned instantly. When the captain said this, he felt that it was somewhat familiar. That's right. Kant was certain that it was familiar. Noticing the strange look between Kant's brows, the mage captain nodded and said, "In fact, you must have also noticed it, my lord. This is the information that the great mages deciphered in this huge sun disk." "I don't understand." Kant frowned. "It's a paragraph." The mage apprentice took a deep breath and slowly opened his mouth. His eyes were full of solemnity, and his tone was like the most solemn chant of a bard. "When the sun rises again, the sacred authority will bloom once more. When the sun rises again, the sacred will bloom once more." Kant frowned and repeated. He slightly lowered his head, and the sense of familiarity in his mind grew stronger and stronger. Finally, an idea flashed through his mind: when the sun rises again, the sacred city of gold will bloom once more. The sacred city of gold. The apprentice frowned slightly. Yes. The corner of Kant's mouth curled up slightly. He had already understood why he had a familiar feeling. Because this was precisely what his teacher, the Hank scholar, had spent most of his life deciphering, studying, and analyzing archaeological history and myths and legends. In the end, he had only obtained a sentence that was close to a flawed prophecy. When the sun rose again, the holy city of gold would bloom once more. The book that recorded this sentence was still at the bottom of the box in Kant's room. The mage captain frowned and said, "It's similar to the information that the archmages deciphered in the sun disk." "It's not similar." Kant shook his head slightly. Looking at the huge disk in front of him that was emitting boundless golden light and was really like the sun, he said softly, "The meaning is exactly the same. It's just that the deciphered information deviated and became the holy city of gold." "I don't understand." The mage captain still frowned. Kant had no intention to explain. This was the essence shared by Hank scholar, or rather, the archaeologists in the academy of the past generations. After deciphering various historical documents, analyzing myths and legends, he finally got a correct, but in fact, deviated prophecy. This was completely different from what the archmages of the Unfoth Empire had analyzed when they studied the sun disk directly. It was not information about the content. It was the method. Kant did not care how different their methods were, as long as he got the result. He just took a deep breath and asked the captain beside him in a deep voice, "How can we make this sun disk leave the space in this hall and go to the desert outside?" "It's very simple. We just need to expand the upper space." The captain asked, "Do we need to expand it now?" "Expand it?" Kant nodded and waved his hand. "Let this sun disk rise above the Oasis lookout." "Yes." The mage and mage apprentices answered in unison. The incantation was read out loud. The mages gathered their mana in the space above. The mysterious incantation was circulating, and above everyone's head, a crack suddenly appeared above the endless space that seemed to be the ceiling. As the incantation and magic power were poured in, it grew bigger and bigger. It was the sky outside, the blue sky that was unique to the Narration desert. Cloudless as ever. Buzz. The huge sun disk let out a slight vibration. The golden light was dazzling, and the entire disk slowly began to float towards the sky. It just happened to pass through the crack and towards the sky outside. It rose bit by bit, as if the sun had risen. Chapter 346, The Divine Authority Bloomed. Hum. A slight trembling sound reverberated through the surrounding void. Just like that, the sun disk slowly passed through the cracks and appeared in the sky of the Narration desert. Just like the sun rising from the east, it slowly, bit by bit, drilled out of the void above the apprentices' dormitory. It carried a supreme power and released an incomparable golden light, floating up into the sky. "Look, it's the sun. It's a new sun. Yeah. That's the sun. That's really the sun. It's the sun that rose from the castle." The busy commoners in the Oasis lookout noticed the sun that had appeared at the top of the council hall. It was completely detached from the void. It was a 20-meter large sun that slowly floated up into the sky. They could not help but exclaim, their faces filled with shock. The Sunday. At the training ground, Man-eyed, who was still arranging training missions, suddenly turned his head. The sun disk that was still floating in the air above the council hall was also emitting an increasingly dense golden light. The huge disk that was almost as tall as a high-level watchtower was even more shocking. Even the training soldiers, who were still fiddling with their armor and weapons, were staring at the disk, which was rising higher and higher above their heads, emitting an infinite amount of golden light. At this moment, they were shocked to realize that in just a short moment, it had already stopped dozens of meters above their heads. It was really like another sun, hanging firmly in the sky from above. As they bathed in the golden light, their depleted physical strength, which had been exhausted from training, was actually recovering. Another tremor from the void appeared. However, in the sky, the sun disk had already stopped rising. The rune array formed by countless precise and sacred sun patterns on the card instantly exploded with an even purer golden light, causing the huge disk to hang in the sky. As the sun shone down, it just happened to shine on the 20-meter-long sun disk. A chill could be felt instantly. On the surrounding 10 hectares of land the scorching air wave instantly disappeared. It was almost noon. The wilted plants were the first to feel the temperature drop. They actually spread out their branches and leaves slightly, basking in the weakened sunlight in the sky that was no longer so scorching. There were also quite a number of bees and grouse that began to buzz as they rushed out of the date palm jungle. The temperature, it seems to have dropped. Yes, the temperature has really dropped. Even the sunlight doesn't feel so hot. It's very comfortable now. The civilians and soldiers took off their headscarves that blocked the sun, their faces filled with shock and surprise. Even the Sarandan people took off their headscarves that was a part of their national dress in surprise. They wiped their sweat and looked curiously at the golden disk above their heads, their eyes shining with an inexplicable light. They all understood that this was the effect of the sun disk. The temperature adjustment was only one of the effects. Kant and the mages had already walked out of the mage apprentices' dormitory and arrived at the top floor of the council hall. Standing inside the aeroblocker wall, they looked up at the sun disk above their heads in shock. Even though they knew that the disk was huge in the folded space of the hall, they still couldn't measure it effectively. The folded space itself had a distortion effect. It could be considered a sequela. However, when it appeared in this world, it was still floating 50 meters above the ground. The huge, golden sun disk really brought about an incomparable shock. P.S. If you don't understand the effect, you can go and look up a picture of the Shurima. If it were to smash down, the entire Drondheim castle would probably be severely damaged. Kant shook his head. He was ashamed that thought even came across in his mind. However, Kant still turned to the mage captain and asked, "I think that this sun disk will be hanging in our sky for a long time. There won't be any problems, right?" "That's right. There won't be any problems." The mage captain nodded. He was also very certain about this. This is related to the technology of the Unfoth Empire, as well as the technology contained in this sun disk itself. However, most of it still comes from you, our most revered and respected Supreme Lord. Me? Kant frowned. He was curious. What's it got to do with me? The great Supreme Lord, Lord Kant. The mage captain took half a step back. The mages and mage apprentices beside him did the same. They placed their right hands on their chests and bowed. Your existence is a unique truth. It is the foundation of our existence. It is irreplaceable and unique. The Varga marksmen and the royal knights also bowed in the same manner. Their attitudes were extremely respectful. Yes, I understand. Kant stretched out his hand. Get up. Yes. Only then did the mages and apprentices return to normal. The archers and royal knights also stood up again. All right. Kant shook his head. These guys were flattering him. Indeed, everyone likes to hear flattery. But now, looking at the sun disk floating in the sky, motionless, absorbing the temperature of the sun to store and regulate its temperature, he nodded with satisfaction and said, "The effect is very good. All 5 special effects could be used." It was absolutely helpful to Kant's current Oasis lookout, the original estate. Just like this constant temperature. It also allowed the plants to grow quickly. It allowed the soldiers and civilians to recover in physical strength quickly. They were all unique, allowing him to fully experience the convenience of the sun disk rising into the sky. Sun disk, repaired, can be strengthened. This huge golden disk engraved with mysterious patterns condensed the incomparable power of the sun. After the repair of the special magic patterns, this strange object regained its vitality and displayed part of its former power. But to reach its peak, it still needs to continue to repair and fuse with the same type of strange substance. Special Effect 1 Temperature Control, absorbs sunlight during the day and lowers the temperature within 10 hectares. Releases sunlight at night and raises the temperature within 10 hectares. Constant maximum temperature is 25 degrees. Minimum temperature is 5 degrees. Special Effect 2 Holy Light, can release holy light within 10 hectares and illuminate the earth like sunlight. Can resist all negative status buffs and allow injured soldiers within the range of holy light to be treated. Special Effect 3 Evil Expulsion, any evil troops will not be able to approach within 10 hectares. If they approach, they will be automatically attacked by holy attacks until no one is left after defeating the evil troops. Special Effect 4 Sun Domain, the coverage area will be expanded to an additional 10-hectare area, and the divine radiance will be spread within the area, allowing the creatures bathed in it to be healthy and the plants to thrive. Special Effect 5 Purification Pulse, after miraculous repair, the sun disk can release a pulse containing extremely positive energy once a week, purifying any target and erasing it in the world. Remark, please use it with extreme caution. Remark, 1 can be placed under the sun to recharge itself, 2 can be fused with other solar disks to strengthen it. Kant's retina was extremely dazzling with the solar disk's familiarity. His breathing was slightly hurried. Very good. Kant could no longer find any other words to describe his current excitement. The rise of the solar disk to the sky had truly brought about an earth-shattering change. He even had enough confidence to contend against the sky of death he was uneasy about. Wait! Right next to him, a Varga marksman suddenly looked towards the north. At the same time, an urgent message was transmitted from the 25-meter-high high-level watchtower above his head to the high-level watchtower at the bottom. The person in charge of this building did not hesitate to ring the huge bronze bell. Dong 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 dong. The sound was urgent. It was the sound of the bell that signaled the arrival of an enemy. Chapter 347, The Approaching Death Knights. Enemy Attack. Enemy Attack. Enemy attack! At the top of the council hall, the Varga marksmen shouted. They quickly guarded their surroundings. Holding longbows, they pulled out the cone arrows in their quivers. They looked around coldly, but more people still drew their bows and looked at the north side of the castle solemnly. At the top of the endless dune on the north side, a black dot was running wildly. On the city wall, the Swadian veteran crossbowmen quickly arrived at their positions. Including the newly recruited Varga archers, they all walked up to the towering arrow towers and took their positions. The city gates on the southeast side and the Urn city gates were already half closed. As the many civilians and construction teams retreated back to the inner part of the castle, these sturdy city gates made of fine iron and high-quality wood were also closed heavily. On the outer and inner walls of the Urn city, many civilians had gathered. If the situation was urgent, the bell tower in the castle would ring with the bells for arming. These civilians, regardless of whether they were men or women, would all be transformed into Swadian militia. They wore iron-plated armor, held hunting crossbow, carried a wide wooden shield and spear, and hung quivers and warmer on their waists. They would be fully armed. Currently, the population of Drondheim castle was close to 3,000, which meant that there would be 3,000 militia. Although they would not be too useful. However, they could defend their city pretty well with its geographical advantage. At least on the city walls, there were still heavy bricks placed there, including thick logs. These were the stone and wood used to defend the city. If they were thrown down, even the most elite level 5 warriors would be demolished. As long as the city guarding forces worked together, they could even fight against tens of thousands of soldiers. It's not an enemy attack. Van Dijk also quickly returned to the top of the council hall. With the power of the underworld, he was extremely fast. As he ran with all his might, he had reached the top floor in less than 10 seconds. His eyes were flashing red like the eyes of a demon, but his voice was unusually grave. "It's our heavy cavalry." "Heavy cavalry?" Kant's eyes were filled with astonishment. Turning his head north, his solemn eyes instantly constricted. In the vast dunes, more than 300 heavy cavalry, armed with horses and men, were getting closer and closer. Although they were spread out, they were extremely orderly. But even so, it was obvious that they were retreating out of terror. "It's our comrades. They are being chased." Cries of alarm rang out from the city walls, especially from the crossbowmen, who were even more furious. This included those at Kant's side. Even the royal knights were in a slight commotion, gritting their teeth and snorting coldly in righteous indignation. Because the 300 heavy cavalry soldiers below were the Swadian man-at-arms. "What's going on?" Kant frowned, because these Swadian man-at-arms were the heavy cavalry troops that he had sent to the salt mine Posthouse to guard the slaves and keep away the undead. At the same time, he had also received information from the desert bandits that the 500 heavy cavalry troops had fallen near the salt mine Posthouse. They might have been surrounded and annihilated by the Undead's Death Knights and Skeleton Cavalry. "It's indeed them." Kant spoke slowly, confirming the identity of the approaching cavalry. As the cavalry got closer and closer, the image of the golden lion on a red background on their flaxen shirts and the kite-shaped shield on their left arms became painfully obvious. It was indeed the Swadian man-at-arms that Kant had sent over. There were originally 500 people, but now there were only 300 people left. He could tell how heavy the casualties were when they broke out of the encirclement. "That's not right." The Varga marksmen did not let down their guard. They looked towards the north with even more caution. Especially at the small door where the high-level watchtower was connected to the top floor of the council hall. There were also agile Varga archers who rushed out, pointing at the dune in the distance. He reported loudly to Kant, "There are still pursuing troops behind our heavy cavalry." According to the watchman, the enemy numbers over 2,000. All of them are cavalry. Pass down the order, get ready for battle. Kant did not hesitate at all. He waved his hand directly and gave an order to Van Dijk, who was beside him. "Van Dijk, lead the Royal Knights and the Swadian Knights to form a support force. Lead the retreating heavy cavalry to inner part of the castle." "Yes." Van Dijk answered. Together with the Royal Knights, they turned around and was about to leave. "Wait." But Kant paused for a moment. After hesitating for a while, he continued, "Have the cavalry enter the Urn city and wait. Only lead them inside the castle after the examination is completed and there are no abnormalities." "I understand." Van Dijk nodded. They actually came so quickly. Kant gently exhaled. He focused his gaze on the dune in the distance to the north. A black mass of cavalry troops had already appeared there. They spread out even more. They held up swords, spears, shields, and wore black armor. Many of them were pale white. The magic of the undead allowed the corpses of the cavalry soldiers who had been dead for countless years to be resurrected and transformed back into knights. Death Knights. And skeleton cavalry. Although they were quite far away, Kant's extraordinary power could be magnified several times when he used it in his eyes. He could clearly see that the seemingly black armor was actually black rust that had accumulated in the precipitation of time. The pale white parts were the skeletons, and the swords, spears, and shields in their hands were even more tattered. However, the ghostly blue soul fire that were unique to the undead were flickering in the hollow eye sockets of their worn-out helmets. This included the skeleton warhorse that was also a skeleton and was wearing a tattered robe. The ghostly blue soul fire flickered. It even added a bone-piercing chill, a chill that came from the depths of the soul, a chill that came from the living against the dead. However, the undead cavalry did not continue chasing. They only stopped at the outermost dune and spread out in a dark mass. They held weapons in their hands and the ghostly blue soul fire flickered in their eye sockets. They stood still, as if they were waiting. The 300 remaining Swadian man-at-arms also returned to the Oasis lookout under the escort of the Royal Knights and Cavalry. They directly entered the urn city that had been basically completed. One by one, they took off their helmets. Panting, their faces were flushed red, and their heads were covered in cold sweat. Their faces were also filled with joy. It was obvious that they had finally breathed a sigh of relief after escaping from the intense feeling of being chased. A faint golden light enveloped them. Right above their heads, the huge sun disk slowly emitted a golden light, sprinkling down on the land of the Oasis lookout like a drizzle. At the same time, it formed a faint pattern formation in the air, covering an area of 10 hectares. The undead cavalry were right outside the area that was covered in the golden light. It seemed to be because of this. The undead cavalry and skeleton cavalry that were emitting a dense negative energy and an evil aura did not continue to chase after the retreating Swadian man-at-arms. The region that was covered by the sun disk contained so much positive energy that it was a forbidden area these undead creatures could not enter. Chapter 348, Kant's Inquiry. The golden light was just enough to obstruct the pursuit of the Death Knights and skeleton cavalry, allowing the Swadian man-at-arms to safely return to the urn city of Drondheim Castle. As they retreated and fought along the way, they were already exhausted, or rather, completely drained. This was the disadvantage of living creatures. As for the Death Knights and skeleton cavalry, because of the characteristics of the dead, they did not have any physical limitations. Although their individual combat ability was weaker, they could harass these heavy cavalry soldiers non-stop. Along the way, they were forced to leave their comrades behind, or they were scattered and separated into small groups because of this. There were even more people. Because they were covering for their comrades' retreat, they launched a counterattack and were drowned in the sea of skeletons. They were able to delay the skeleton cavalry and win time that was crucial to the others' retreat. It was also thanks to this. If the skeleton cavalry was any stronger in individual combat, even the Swadian man-at-arms with had the best defense and the strongest charge would all die on the spot. Even if there were 2 gold-tier cavalry fighting with their lives on the line, they would not be able to break out of the encirclement. Similarly, it was also due to the combat strength of the heavy cavalry that they lived up to the name of a level 4 heavy cavalry. Most of them had come back alive. All of them retreated into the urn city. Only then did Bandake, the Royal Knights, and the Swadian Knights who were in charge of keeping the rear, ride their horses in. One could not tell whether they were happy or angry under the fully covered helmet, but one could tell that their eyes were solemn. Bandake waved his hand and gave the order directly, close the city gates immediately. The crossbowmen and infantrymen who were in charge of guarding the city gates immediately took action. The civilians who were originally stationed on the city walls were also helping out. Clang! As the sturdy wooden city gates were closed, the fence made of pig iron was also lowered. The city gates were closed, completely separating the castle and the outside world into 2 different worlds. Rest here. Bandake extended his hand at the same time and gave the order to the retreating heavy cavalry. He looked coldly at the Swadian men-at-arms who had relaxed after surviving the desperate situation. With a solemn expression, he said, "After you rest, you will be examined. I hope you will think seriously about the cause and effect of this battle." "Yes." An orderly response immediately rang out among the Swadian men-at-arms. Even though they had almost escaped from the encirclement and retreated, they still maintained their outstanding qualities. This was the confidence of the elite heavy cavalry of the Kingdom of Swadia, or it was the self-discipline that they had developed from long-term training. The golden light shone brightly and attached to the bodies of these heavy cavalry soldiers, bringing warmth and recuperation. Their physical strength was slowly recovering. There were also civilians who brought over hot oatmeal and roasted dried sausage to fill their empty stomachs. Returning to the Oasis lookout was equivalent to returning home. They could enjoy all the peace and stability. Even if they needed to be investigated, it was just a routine matter. After all, they had just gone through a series of fierce battles with the undead, so they needed to check if their bodies carried the plague bacteria. The undead's fame was not limited to an army made up of zombies, an endless sea of skeletons and corpses. There was also the plague bacteria that spread all kinds of plagues. The heavy cavalry also understood. Coincidentally, during the examination process, each of them sat beside their warhorse and drank large mouthfuls of oatmeal from a wooden bowl. They ate the crispy and burnt dried sausage, enjoying the hard-won peace. Beside them, there were civilians who helped to move the food trough and place it in the corner of the wall. With the addition of feed and water, they fed the warhorse that was also tired. Everything was laid out very carefully. On the city wall, Man-eyed looked at the heavy cavalry that were squatting on the ground waiting for the inspection to end with a solemn expression. There was a hint of worry between his brows. As an elite merchant, he had already smelled the cruelty of the coming war. Everyone was deep in thought, and the space fell silent. Only the inspection team formed by the knights were talking to each other in low voices. However, at this moment, a Varga archer was running quickly in the streets of the castle. The city gate opened a crack, and he stepped in. Looking at the heavy cavalry who were taking a short break inside, his eyes flashed with a hint of solemnity. He said to Bandake in a deep voice, "Lord Bandake, Lord Kant has ordered their commander to go to the council hall immediately and report the reason and details of their return." "Yes, I understand." Bandake nodded and waved his hand at the same time to pass on this order. Soon, the commander of this heavy cavalry unit walked out. "We are here." Two royal knights walked over with quick steps. Their faces were filled with determination and their breathing was heavy. It was obvious that the short break had not allowed them to fully recover the physical strength that had been overdrawn for the past few days. They took off the plate armor on their heads. The robes on their bodies were tattered. Even the silver plate armor had many dents and white marks. Occasionally, one could see the black liquid stained on the linen robes. It was obvious that they had broken out of an encirclement. They looked very miserable. It was not just them. In fact, the surrounding Swadian man-at-arms were all the same. Everyone was injured and their chain armor was slightly damaged. As for many of them, they had already given up their spears. Only the spiked warhammer for close combat were still hanging on their waists. "Thank you for your hard work." The Varga archer lowered his head. The royal knight shook his head and said solemnly, "Everything is for my lord." They were all soldiers from the continent of Karadia. At this moment, the conflict between the Kingdom of Swadia and the Kingdom of Varga has long since been resolved. Working together to eliminate the foreign enemies was what concerned them more. Fighting among themselves at such a critical time was obviously something that only an idiot could do. Of course, Kant would never allow internal strife to occur. "Let's go." The Varga archer turned around and led the way. He walked in front, and on the way there, he reminded the two royal knights behind him, "Please recall as soon as possible what happened between the salt mine Posthouse and the castle, including the origin of the enemy troops, their numbers, how many times they resisted and fought, and whether they encountered any strange phenomena. You have to answer clearly." The two Swadian royal knights who came out from the skeleton cavalry nodded. "We are prepared. It is all the truth that we have personally experienced. There will be no falsehood." "That's good." The Varga archer nodded. Both sides were silent. Soon, they arrived at the council hall along the road. After being checked by the Lion Knight guards, they entered the hall. Kant sat on his original throne and waited for them. "My lord." The Varga archer was the first to speak. "They have arrived." The two royal knights walked forward quickly and half knelt on the ground. They lowered their heads and said in shame, "My lord, please forgive us for retreating from the salt mine Posthouse and causing the entire area to fall into the hands of the enemy." "All right, there's a reason for this. I don't blame you." Kant waved his hand, indicating for the messenger, the Varga archer, to move aside. But looking at these two royal knights, he asked indifferently, "What I'm curious about is, how did the salt mine Posthouse, which was guarded by 500 Swadian men-at-arms led by two grand knights, fall so easily and retreat in such a sorry state? Did it lose its proper dignity?" Chapter 349, The Royal Knight's Narration. This was a problem that demanded attention. Kant did not have the slightest intention of questioning or doubting. However, for the two royal knights who possessed the strength of a king, as well as the 500 heavy cavalry of Swadian men-at-arms who were equipped with chain armor and were at the knight level, to be defeated just like that, there was no doubt a big problem. Kant focused his gaze. He also saw that the plate armor of the two royal knights was already full of potholes and scratches caused by weapons. He continued in an extremely solemn manner, "I believe in your loyalty, but I don't know what kind of enemies you have encountered. I want to know how they defeated you so easily." "Yes, that's right, my lord. 3 days ago, in the middle of the night, we were ambushed by the undead cavalry for the first time. Accompanied by a cold current, they rode their horses and galloped on the salt and alkali soil that had condensed on the ground." The royal knight opened his mouth and did not refute at all. He only described what he knew in a serious manner. They retreated in such a sorry state. They were indeed defeated. If it was not for their outstanding military accomplishments and their long-standing experience on the battlefield that supported them, the ordinary cavalry would have fallen apart. They would have ran for their own lives and fled all over the mountains and plains. That would be the true defeat. They would be caught one by the enemy like they were slaughtering lambs, and then their throats would be easily slit. Defeated soldiers were more worthless than bandits. The principle also applies in this world. And to be able to defeat the elite Swadian men-at-arms, or even come close to defeating them and have all of them fall apart, that was Kant's main concern. He wanted to know what the enemy was. How did they defeat his troops? The royal knight continued to explain. "When we discovered that it was already too late, they quickly appeared at our tent. If it wasn't for the cavalry who were in charge of sentry duty taking the lead to meet the battle on foot, the position where the undead cavalry charged was also the tent where the slaves lived. I reckon that we would have been completely wiped out by the first wave of the undead cavalry's sneak attack." Continue. Kant's expression was solemn. "Yes." The royal knight nodded and continued, "We reacted very quickly. Everyone was fully equipped to face the enemy. In front of the two knights with extraordinary powers, we defeated all the skeleton cavalry at the front and managed to stabilize the front line. However, at this moment, those slaves were already running around in panic. We did not care about them. We only stabilized ourselves and prepared while fighting. We brought our supplies and got on our horses to retreat." Kant nodded and said calmly, "You did well. This is just a group of useless slaves. We really don't need to care. We will have more slaves in the future." That's exactly what we were thinking. So, we prepared to retreat under the assault of more and more skeleton cavalry. The royal knight said with a difficult expression, And then. Kant sensed the hesitation of the royal knights. Frowning slightly, he said in a deep voice, "Tell us what happened directly. Since it has already happened, it cannot be undone, but it can prepare us for the future." And then the royal knights shook their heads and smiled bitterly. It was the Death Knights. The Death Knights. Kant repeated this word. However, his frown deepened. "That's right, it's the Death Knights. I know this troop class of the undead race. Perhaps it's the commander of the skeleton cavalry. Yes, you are correct, my lord. The royal knight smiled bitterly. It's indeed the commander. There are 5 death knights among them. They actually possess extraordinary powers with negative energy. They entangled the 2 of us. At the same time, they allowed even more skeleton cavalry to entangle the heavy cavalry of Swadia, directly surrounding us. It was also because of this battle that we lost dozens of heavy cavalry. During our attempt to break out of the encirclement, we even lost 20 to 30 people. At that point, we were most likely doomed. Is that so? Although Kant asked, he frowned and understood more. This was no different from what he had guessed. Since the enemy was a death knight, it was normal for them to have extraordinary powers. Although the undead were a special race that was born from other races, it was still similar to the mainstream system. If one was a knight and the commander of the undead army, according to Kant's understanding in the movies and literature works in his previous life, it would be natural for them to have some intelligence and even extraordinary powers at his disposal. After all, this was also a fantasy world. Along the way, we encountered the pursuit of the undead cavalry. We are fortunate that we are already prepared, so we did not suffer any serious injuries. Although there are a lot of undead cavalry soldiers, and they look scary, their true combat strength is still not enough. They are weak as bones. The royal knight hesitated for a moment, but still said with certainty, 1 Swadian man-at-arms heavy cavalry can easily kill 3 skeleton cavalry. If we go all out, killing 5 skeleton cavalry would not be a problem. Continue. I'm very curious about the true combat strength of those undead. Kant nodded. Oh, maybe I'm bluffing. The royal knight said, but according to my observation, at that time, we, the 500 Swadian man-at-arms, paid a certain price to break through the encirclement of at least 3,000 skeleton cavalry. Moreover, behind the dozens of casualties, at least 200 skeleton cavalry were beaten to pieces. And when they pursued us, they often caught up, but they were unable to truly defeat us. Kant frowned slightly. He was even more curious after hearing the words of the royal knights. However, he was also a little curious in his heart. The royal knights would not lie. Moreover, to be able to charge out of the encirclement of so many skeleton cavalry, it also meant that these undead cavalry were useless. If the cavalry of the dukedom of Leo were here, they would probably be able to surround and kill these Swadian man-at-arms. On the battlefield, the advantage in numbers was not something that could be easily made up for with a little advantage in quality. This was also something Kant was certain of. And now, according to the royal knights, 3,000 plus skeleton cavalry had surrounded them. Among them, there were 5 death knights who possessed extraordinary powers but still allowed them to break out of the encirclement. This was enough to show the weakness of the undead in terms of individual combat strength. If we had 1,500 Swadian man-at-arms, we would be able to easily defeat those skeleton cavalry. The royal knight finally concluded, if we had 3,000 Swadian man-at-arms, we would be able to directly crush those skeleton cavalry into bones. At this moment, on the stairs next to them, the Variga archer quickly came over as a messenger. Standing beside Kant's seat, he reported respectfully, we discovered that the undead cavalry had begun to retreat, leaving behind a death knight with rather gorgeous equipment. We speculated that the other party might have deliberately left a messenger behind, wanting to negotiate with us. Negotiate? Kant revealed a playful smile. How interesting. Chapter 350, Negotiations. These undead cavalry from the depths of the desert actually had the intention to negotiate. It was indeed interesting, but the corner of Kant's curled lips did not represent the solemnity in the depths of his eyes. In fact, this phenomenon was not truly interesting, but rather, it was sheer trouble. This meant that the undead were indeed intelligent. They all knew how to negotiate. Actually, one could probably guess that. They even knew how to use a sneak attack, which meant that among the undead, there was definitely a commander who was not inferior to the living in terms of intelligence and also equipped with a certain level of war wisdom in decision-making. The Varga archer asked from the side, "Lord, do you want to send someone over first?" "Yes, I do." Kant nodded. However, he stood up and said calmly, "I'll go myself." Only by going himself would he be able to find out how intelligent the undead were. Of course, this trip would definitely be dangerous, and Kant would also maintain a certain amount of vigilance. He waved his hand at the two royal knights and said, "You two go and rest. Tomorrow, submit a document. I hope that whatever you encounter will be written on it in full, without anything left out." "Yes." The two royal knights nodded and left at the right time. Kant looked behind him. The Lion Knight and the Royal Knights were standing in 2 rows. He calculated in his mind and ordered, "Take 10 Lion Knights, 10 Royal Knights, 10 Varga Marksmen and 5 Mages. Get ready. Follow me to see what those undead are up to and how they can negotiate with us." "Understood." Everyone answered firmly and began to prepare themselves. Soon, they formed the team Kant had ordered. Although there were only 35 people, their combat strength was definitely not ordinary. Whether it was the 20 Grand Knights, the 10 top marksmen who could pierce through 100 paces, or the 5 mages who could cast all kinds of spells suitable for the battlefield, all of them could enhance him and ensure the stability and safety of the battlefield. Behind him was Drondheim Castle. If there was a problem, the large army on standby could be ready to provide support at any time. Everything was ready. At this time, Van Dijk and Manide, who had heard the rumors about the negotiation, also returned to the council hall. Manide looked at Kant, who was ready to leave, and his expression changed slightly. He said with some solemnity, "Lord Kant, it's too much of a joke to take such a risk personally. Please let me go to the negotiation on your behalf. You are a supreme lord. How can you be compared to those lowly undead?" Van Dijk was even more solemn. He bent down and placed his right hand on his chest. He pleaded with Kant in an extremely respectful tone, "Let me, your most humble servant, handle the negotiations with those disgusting corpses and skeletons. What you need to do is to drink and relax in the hall and wait for the news of victory." As an apostle of the underworld, he had been instilled with the power of the underworld demons. It could be said that Van Dijk, who was a human-shaped demon, had an extremely high talent in dealing with such things. The underworld demons were also evil creatures that gathered negative energy. This was the same as the undead. Therefore, whether they fought against each other or involved themselves, or argued and negotiated with each other, they all had innate talent. At the very least, they would not be affected by the spiritual influence of the negative energy of the undead on the living. "There's no need. I can handle it myself." Kant rejected the two's idea. However, he muttered to himself for a while and still said to Manide, "You will guard the castle. If the situation goes wrong, immediately send troops to pick us up. Pay more attention to the situation around us. Be extremely cautious." "Yes." Manide nodded. Kant then looked at Van Dijk. "You can go with me." "Understood," Van Dijk immediately replied. "That's all." Kant took a deep breath, his eyes slightly gloomy. "If they want to take my oasis, at least these undead who should have been in their graves should reassess their capabilities." Everything was ready. Kant personally led the team out of the castle. They set off at the east gate, heading towards the dune group outside the date palm jungle in the north. The guards followed close behind and looked around vigilantly, especially at the top of the dune in front. Someone stood there alone, on his warhorse with his weapons withdrawn. It was the Death Knight. Kant narrowed his eyes. After careful observation, he could not help but feel solemn. More than half of the unique armor was left. It seemed to be made of gold. Even if it was stained pitch black, it was still shining in the sun, giving off the majesty of the ancient gods. On their waists were scepters made of gold, similar to a nail-head warhammer, but it was a completely blunt weapon. The helmet had the beauty of the sun and the gods. They also had pitch-black war horses, which were also wearing the golden horse armor, looking like knights from the old era who walked out of an ancient palace, carrying the remains of the ancient era and staring with soul fires in their empty eye sockets. As Kant approached the Death Knight, the temperature seemed to have dropped. However, Kant and the others were not afraid. They had their own courage. Similarly, the golden light released by the sun disk above their heads shone on their bodies, bringing not only physical recovery, but also fearlessness to evil and the glory of the sun. The troops stopped at the bottom of the Udny. Kant led Bandake up. The area covered by the sun disk behind them was right in the middle of the dune. The distance between the two sides was not even 10 meters. At the same time, about 100 meters away from the dune behind the Death Knight, the dark mass was the 2,000-plus skeleton cavalry. Small wisps of black fog were emitted from their bodies, seemingly condensing into a ball and not dispersing. The faint blue soul fire was jumping with joy, carrying a hatred for the living. That is the sun disk. The Death Knight was the first to speak, but he did not speak to Kant, rather, he muttered to himself. Under the helmet, his pale face was still intact. Those weren't eyeballs in his eye sockets, but a ball of pure soul fire. It seemed to be looking at the floating sun disk in the distant sky as he sighed, once again I see the sun disk rising to the sky releasing the glory of the sun god. Kant shook his head and smiled, no, you misunderstood. The sun disk did not release the glory of the sun god, but my glory. You can think of it this way. The sun god has been dead for 10,000 years. A human, the lowly race betrayer of the gods. The Death Knight retracted his gaze. He looked at Kant and said in a calm tone, the sun god has fallen 10,000 years ago and it's not something you can slander because you are still enjoying the protection of the sun god. Is that so? Kant was emotionless and said calmly, why don't we talk in human language?